Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to discuss the very beneficial economic effects that I anticipate would stem from indefinite human life extension. Now, before I am met with the common objections, let me describe the scenario that I'm actually going to be discussing. This kind of indefinite life extension can only be achieved by attaining the indefinite youthfulness of human beings. That is to say, that if people live indefinitely, they're not going to live indefinitely in a frail, decaying, senescent state, because for the most part, it is that frail, decaying, senescent state that ultimately results in death, and in the meantime, results in much greater susceptibility to disease. So there's one objection to indefinite life extension that we can get rid of right from the starting point. It's the idea that if people's lifespans become lengthened dramatically, they will be in this senescent state for much longer, and that's going to burden the healthcare system. It's going to be tremendously expensive. It is also going to burden all of the so-called retirement security systems that Western governments have set up, such as the Social Security system in the United States and various other pension systems in Canada and in Europe. Well, if we have indefinite human longevity, we also have indefinite human youthfulness, and quite the contrary, that's going to greatly unburden the medical system, and that's going to greatly unburden the government-provided pension systems to the point of rendering them all completely unnecessary from anyone's standpoint. Today, libertarian thinkers such as myself will also suggest that these kinds of collective pension arrangements are not necessary, that there's a better way if individuals provide for themselves in their later years. However, if indefinite youthfulness is achieved via indefinite life extension, then people in the mainstream will also recognize that these pension systems are no longer necessary. If you have the health and vigor of a 25-year-old, then you do not need Social Security. You do not need Medicare or any other kind of subsidized health insurance. You can accumulate your own resources and pay your own way to whatever standard of living you desire, as well as whatever healthcare you will need. And there will, of course, still be healthcare in that system, the kind of healthcare that is necessary to maintain one's body, to periodically rejuvenate it, to perform research into combating an ever larger array of diseases, and of course to stop these diseases at a very early stage. With the kind of technology that can bring about indefinite longevity, it will also be possible to diagnose certain harmful diseases much earlier. For instance, it might be possible to diagnose a cancer several years before significant tumors are formed, and therefore a cancer could be caught so early that it would never pose a significant risk to a person's life. That would be one necessary large component in achieving indefinite life extension, but really what will happen is a large number of medical advances, each in a particular field targeting a particular disease or delaying a particular condition of old age. All of these will come together and make it possible for people to be biologically younger much longer without this necessary upper limit that exists during our time. So, to understand how that will in reality affect the economic situation of the world, we need to understand the concept of time preference. Time preference can be understood fairly simply with the following illustration. I think all of us, when we're offered the choice to have $100 today or $100 exactly a year from now, will choose $100 today. These are equal satisfactions, unless the world dramatically changes exactly 1 year from now. But let's say that the state of the world is relatively predictable, and you know that $100 a year from now will buy about as much as $100 today. I think you will prefer $100 today. But what if you were offered a choice of $100 today versus $101 a year from now, effectively a 1% annual interest rate? What would you choose? Would you take the $100 right now and spend them? Or would you defer that gratification for that extra dollar 1 year from now? Now, of course, a 1% interest rate is quite pathetic, at least compared to historical interest rates that have been paid, but that's about what you will get with a bank savings account today. Is it worth it for you to put $100 in the bank right now and prevent yourself from having the use of that for a year in order to get that extra dollar? And different people will answer that question differently. Some people will say, no, it's not worth it for me. I need to get $105 a year from now. Some people will say, no, that's quite good. It's more than worth it for me. I would even be happy with $100.50 a year from now. These kinds of differences can be called differences in a person's rate of time preference. To what extent does a person prefer present satisfactions to future satisfactions? Or another way of putting it is, to what extent does a person discount future satisfactions? So someone who would be willing to have $101 a year from now, or $100.50, not as much of a difference from what he could get today, but would still be willing to defer that gratification, could be considered to have a lower rate of time preference. That person is more willing to put off a present satisfaction for a future gain. Someone who insists on a much higher future gain in order to put off a present satisfaction can be considered to have a high rate of time preference. So if someone says, I would rather take $100 today unless I can get $200 or more a year from now, that's an extremely high rate of time preference. Essentially, this person would need to be paid an effective annual interest rate of 100% in order to be willing to defer the gratification of having those resources for a year. Now, the rate of time preference of an individual is determined by a variety of factors. And really, it's not possible to tidily enumerate them all. Some of them have to do with the particular individual's character and particular tastes and preferences and enjoyments that that individual would like. But I think one great aspect that definitely plays a role in time preference is the individual's time horizon. To what extent does the individual see his future as stretching onward? To what extent does that individual take the future into account when making decisions? And to what extent does that individual think that it's even worthwhile to plan for the future? So, as an extreme example, let's say a given individual is a terminal cancer patient and he's told he has 6 months to live, and nobody in his condition had yet survived past that 6-month time frame. So how will he behave? Let's say he has a fair amount of money, no heirs to whom he would wish to delegate that money after his death. That individual would be very motivated to spend that money on shorter-term kinds of enjoyments, essentially to try to get as much use out of it while he can, because in 6 months he's pretty sure that he will not be alive anymore. The exact opposite of that scenario is what would happen with indefinite human life extension. because now people's time horizons will become much longer. Most people today only think of their own futures in terms of the subsequent 50, 60, maybe, for the ones who are very future-oriented, 80 years. If they believe that they will live particularly long, or they're quite young, or they may even think in terms of the lifespans of their children, but not much farther beyond that. Some people might say, well, they're not just working for themselves, they're not just working for their children, they're not just making decisions taking that into account, they also value the well-being of future generations, even future generations whom they will never meet. I know that there's a lot of rhetoric that goes on to that effect, and probably some people at least are sincere in that rhetoric. However, to say that one values something like that in the abstract is not the same as to value something because it is directly going to impact one's own life. One can, of course, sympathize with the situation of what a future generation will be going through. But it is more remote. It is more of an abstract kind of consideration. And really, there's not that same kind of direct investment in that future state as there would be if one were actually living in that future state, and if one had a very strong and reasonable expectation of being able to live in that future state. So, if indefinite human life extension were to occur, people's rates of time preference, I think, would be greatly reduced. Their time preferences would become longer, which would imply more of a future orientation. There would be more of an orientation toward deferring gratification for much larger future rewards. Because, for instance, right now, if you are 20 years old and you have some money that you want to save for the future, at what point in time would you think, with your present life expectancy, it would be a good idea to withdraw that money and use it all up? Well, you're probably going to want to do that sometime within the next 50 years, just to be safe. You may live much longer than that, even given the state of present medical technology, but you also wouldn't want to spend it all in your very last few years of life. So probably by the time you're 70, you're going to want to have some sort of use and enjoyment of that money. But let's say you could reasonably expect to live to be 500. How long would you keep that money saved? How long would you keep investing it? And in the meantime, it would, of course, contribute to productive activities that other people would engage in. How long would you do that before you personally enjoy the accumulated rewards? Now, there are several implications to that, because I think most people in that situation would keep their money in a savings account or an investment account much longer. That means that more people will accumulate more capital and more resources for their own use, but also for the use of others during the meantime. So that is going to imply much greater wealth across the board. Furthermore, there's going to be another major effect. The longer you live, and the longer you are in a youthful, healthy, intellectually capable state, the more you will be able to learn. Indeed, right now, one of the biggest obstacles to learning among individuals is that life is just too short. There's not enough time to accumulate, for most people, enough useful knowledge to know really well more than one or perhaps two particular disciplines. One of the results of that is a hyper-specialization that is somewhat stunting of progress. Because one of the most important ways in which progress is done is by linking together knowledge from several distinct fields. So it's not just by narrowing in on one area and refining it in greater detail that progress gets made. It's when a fundamental insight from one area is brought into another area that a whole new avenue of discovery becomes available. And we've seen throughout history every major industry that revolutionizes people's lives, for instance, information technology or biotechnology or nuclear physics, those industries become possible. They get formed when an insight from one field is brought and combined with another field. The longer people live, the more opportunities there will be for every individual to become a Renaissance man, to become familiar with a multiplicity of fields and to tie them together, to integrate them. Because the issue isn't so much a lack of knowledge diffused throughout the civilization, it's actually a lack of knowledge concentrated in particular individuals, all of whom could put it to good use, who know how the pieces fit together. And ultimately, it is desirable to have all of human knowledge interact in this integrated way, because we inhabit one reality, and all aspects of that reality are interrelated, even though in academic studies and in particular jobs, they get compartmentalized into disciplines and subdisciplines. A more integrated approach toward reality, but also an approach that doesn't neglect the details, is one that can bring about much more progress. At the same time, this kind of Renaissance man orientation will also be accompanied by greatly increased leisure. The entire concept of retirement, as it's known today, is going to change dramatically. I don't think that periods in which an individual doesn't do any paid work will go away altogether. Rather, what is likely to happen is that individuals will have serial careers. They will pursue one field for 20 or 30 years, then they'll take a break. They will pursue the next field for 20 or 30 years, and then they will take another break. And perhaps, in doing so, they will master multiple fields. They will be able to take something from their past careers into their subsequent careers. And as a result, they will not only have a much more varied and interesting work life, but they will also be much more productive in it. And furthermore, of course, the longer people live, the more leisure they will have in those intervening periods, as well as during the time that they are actually working. If they believe that they're going to have hundreds more years to pursue productive careers, they may not want to work to the point of stressing themselves out or wearing themselves down in a way. That often happens today because people feel like they don't have much time. People feel like, well, they have to fit in a certain amount of career accomplishment while their physical capacities still permit. If people lived indefinitely, that wouldn't be a concern anymore because they could rely on having those physical capacities for centuries to come. So perhaps the workday will be shorter. People will, of course, work much longer overall during their lifetimes. And there will be more opportunities to take breaks. There will be more leisure, both during the periods when one is employed for pay and during those serial retirements, there will probably be a different term by which they will become known. This greater opportunity for leisure will result in greater awareness of the richness of the world in other respects. Because during one's leisure time, one is one's own boss. One gets to direct one's own activities and choose what to pursue. I think that will result in people being much better rounded, which in turn, of course, will have positive feedback effects on how they think when they do work for pay and what insights they can apply to their careers. And I think in having this greater leisure as well as this Renaissance man orientation, people will become a lot more cosmopolitan. They will see all of the variety of the world and all of the variety of people. They will get to sample it a lot more than most people do today. And that will give them a greater appreciation of those who are unlike them. That will give them a greater degree of tolerance and a greater willingness to share values and trade with people who are not like them. This will result in a more peaceful world. It will result in a richer world, certainly, because of the increased opportunities for exchange. Various atrocities born out of bigotry, for instance, racism or warfare, will greatly diminish and hopefully will disappear altogether. Because not only is there a much greater knowledge of people who are different, but there's also a much greater valuation of one's own life and of one's own future. Historically, people who have been willing to fight wars were people who were deprived, whose lives were very miserable, who didn't have a lot of economic opportunities, who didn't have a very long life expectancy, so they felt that they did not have much to lose. They might as well go out and try to conquer the neighboring tribe or the neighboring nation and steal their belongings so as to have a slightly richer remaining few years of their lives. That was the enticement of warfare historically, and more recently there have been attempts to legitimize it by giving it an ideological motivation or a nationalistic motivation, but ultimately war is about people who are discontented trying to appropriate something through force because they don't feel like they have the leisure, the space, the opportunity to acquire those kinds of goods through peaceful means. That will go away. And more generally, there will be a greater valuation of individual human life. Because every time a life would be lost, more potential years of life would be lost. It's no longer that if a person dies in a car accident, that person could have lived for another 20 to 60 years. Rather, if a person dies in a car accident, that person could have lived for another 500 years or 1,000 years, or we don't know how long. So as a result, there will be a greater emphasis on physical safety. People will be much more reluctant to take the kinds of everyday risks that we take today just in order to live and to get around. Think about the daily commute to work in most places throughout the Western world. This is actually one of the most routinely dangerous activities to which people expose themselves. In the United States, 30 to 40,000 people every year die from automobile accidents. In a society where people live much longer, there's going to be a great deal of impetus to change that, to improve safety, so that these kinds of absolutely pointless deaths do not occur in the course of people routinely going about their own business. So there are several major changes that will happen. First of all, I think the whole structure of paid work will change. There will be more of a shift toward working remotely with technologies that are already available today but will be much more powerful in that future. For instance, telecommuting, using the internet, using video conferencing, being able to work through a website as an independent contractor. People will be much more reluctant to get into a vehicle if they believe that there would be an accident. On the other hand, when they do travel, the vehicles they travel in will be much safer. For instance, there would be autonomous vehicles, cars that drive themselves. There are already tests of those vehicles being performed in various parts of the world. Google is testing them in California and in Nevada. There's a company in Germany that is testing autonomous vehicles, as well as a company in China. So the seeds of this kind of very beneficial change are already being sown. But because of the longer time preference, the greater future orientation, people will also become cognizant of risks that are routinely ignored today. So let's say your home is in a 100-year floodplain. That's an area that's determined, given the best knowledge that we have, to have about a 1 in 100 chance of flooding every year. That means that, on average, that area could be expected to have one flood every 100 years. Most people today living in that kind of area are not going to worry very much about flooding risk, because chances are they will not be alive by the time the flood happens. At least, while that's not a certainty, the probability of them dying before the flood gets to them is high enough that they will really discount that eventuality and not prepare for it particularly. Another example of this is with regard to earthquakes. There are a lot of areas of the world that are quite seismically active. Earthquakes of the kind that cause major damage to property and human lives are very infrequent, but when they do happen, they're very severe. The frequent earthquakes are the ones of lower magnitude, and they don't damage very much. So a person today, with today's life expectancy, can live in a seismically active area and never experience a major earthquake. So most people don't plan for that kind of eventuality. This is going to change with indefinite human life extension. And that change, while there will be an increased perception of risk, will actually be extremely beneficial in terms of addressing those risks that were previously largely neglected. There would be a much greater emphasis on both disaster prevention and disaster mitigation. A lot of science will be devoted toward how to make sure that natural disasters that have hitherto been considered beyond our control can be prevented. And this applies to a whole host of disasters. One could say the same about a tornado or a hurricane or an epidemic of the magnitude of the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed more people than all of the casualties of World War I. Most people do not factor preparation for those kinds of disasters into their day-to-day lives. But if they can expect to live for millennia, that will change. And it's not only these kinds of disasters which have been relatively routine within the larger time frame of human history. There are other, even greater possible disasters that thus far have occurred on a scale beyond the human scale. One such disaster would be an ice age. Ice ages have recurred rather frequently in prehistory. Every 100,000 years or so, there would be an ice age. And during the time of early humans, there was also an ice age that for a long time greatly stunted the ability of human civilization to thrive. It was only at the end of the latest ice age that the agricultural revolution could take effect, because finally there was enough arable land, enough land where there was a warm climate that's suitable to developing an advanced civilization. If another ice age were to happen within the next several thousand years or tens of thousands of years, how can it be prevented? That would be a big question that human beings who live indefinitely would have to face, and they would be personally invested in finding a solution. What about questions such as the long-term effects of waste and pollution, and how to dispose of those? Well, right now, nuclear power plants can produce waste that will be around for tens of thousands of years. Where do you put it? Right now, much of it is stored on the premises of the nuclear power plants. There have been attempts to deliver it somewhere else, for instance, the Yucca Mountain repository in Nevada, but those attempts have ultimately been shelved because there's not a lot of certainty about what really will happen to that waste on a time frame of tens of thousands of years. So people who live indefinitely are going to have to find a solution to how to dispose of these kinds of longer-term possible contaminants so that they don't pose a safety risk. Finally, there is a huge existential threat to human beings in the form of a meteor hitting the Earth. It's believed that the impact of an object from outer space was what resulted in the extinction of dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Clearly, human civilization is not immune from a similar impact. These are events that are extremely infrequent, but also colossally severe. Human beings who live indefinitely would have a greater probability of encountering such impacts and would have a greater impetus of developing technology that could deflect an asteroid or a meteor or a comet that was headed toward the Earth. And there could be even an economic motive in doing that. For instance, instead of just deflecting and redirecting an asteroid, why not try to capture the asteroid and harvest its minerals? There would be more time, and there would also be more incentive for these individuals to develop those technologies. It would be easier with indefinite longevity to develop those technologies than it is today, because the same people would continue to be around. Instead of people dying and passing their knowledge on to the next generation, that knowledge could continue to accumulate within the same human beings. This is much more efficient, because even though there is civilizational progress every generation, so much gets lost in transmission. So many skills do not get passed on. For a variety of reasons, not everyone has the opportunity to teach someone else. Some people might die before they have that chance, even if they're willing. And furthermore, every short-lived human today has limited time and a limited mental capacity, so even if someone from a subsequent generation wanted to learn from a previous generation, there's only so much that person could learn. So it's very important that these problems be addressed, and for the sake of the survival of the entire human species, that they be addressed by individuals who live long enough to be able to collect within themselves all the pieces from a variety of disciplines that will be necessary to solve huge existential threats, like the possibility of an object from space colliding with the Earth. A longer-term project that really ought to interest human beings who live indefinitely will be space colonization. Finding other habitats for human beings. While human beings are stuck on this one planet, they remain immensely vulnerable. Any calamity of sufficient size could wipe out the entire species or plunge it back into a dark age. An impact from an object such as a large enough meteor would do it. A planetary nuclear war would do it. A sufficiently devastating epidemic, say taking the Spanish flu and magnifying its destructiveness by a power of 10, which is certainly conceivable, would do it. So, as long as humanity remains confined to one planet, there's this risk of losing everything that our civilization has so far achieved. With indefinite human life extension, there would be hundreds of years to deliberate about what is the best way to populate other worlds. It would be an immensely time-consuming process because flying into outer space requires tremendous expenditures of energy. And with the technology we have today, for instance, with a space shuttle, it would take millions of years, literally, to travel to a different star system. What could be possible solutions? Well, some attempts might involve terraforming nearby planets, for instance, terraforming Mars. A longer range attempt would be to actually send a crew of humans to a habitable world in another star system. With the recent Kepler telescope deployed by NASA, some candidate habitable worlds are beginning to be identified, and surely with future technology there would be much more accurate and frequent identification of these kinds of habitable worlds. And this is a project that currently cannot be accomplished within the typical human lifetime. It would take hundreds of years to realize the kind of space colonization that I'm describing, setting up viable human habitats in other places in the solar system, as well as throughout the galaxy. That's going to be actually a harder problem than the problem of preserving our own bodies from disease, decay, and death. But if we can manage to preserve our own bodies from disease, decay, and death, that would certainly help toward solving this greater challenge of space colonization. On a more local level, there's going to be a reorientation of consumer demand. Again, because of the longer time horizons, the lower rate of time preference, consumers are going to want more durable goods, goods that can last much longer, hundreds of years, as well as goods that are more of an investment type of good rather than an immediate consumption type of good. An investment type of good, or a capital good, is a good that can produce other goods, essentially. And sometimes the distinction between an investment good and a consumption good is blurred because much of it depends on what you use it for. For instance, your computer is an investment good to the extent that you can create other goods with it. You can create works of writing, art, music. However, it can also be a consumption good if you use it to, for instance, play a computer game. Now, at the same time, it can be both a consumption good and an investment good if what you're doing is both for your own enjoyment as well as to create goods that are useful for other people. So the distinction is fuzzy, but what we will see less of in a society of people who live indefinitely is the kind of splurging consumption that shows no regard for the next day. Of course, most of you are familiar with the old saying, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die." That was the attitude of many people with resources, historically, especially when life expectancy was much shorter, because that's all they could do. If they had wealth even, they didn't know how long they were going to live. Even the kings and aristocrats would often die very early in their lives, in their 30s and 40s, from debilitating diseases that medicine at that time could do nothing about. So in prior eras, particularly before the Industrial Revolution, one would frequently see this kind of bizarre combination of extreme opulence on the part of some people, on the one hand, and squalor and misery on the part of most, on the other, existing side by side. And most often, the people who had resources didn't particularly care about alleviating the plight of those who were suffering, because they didn't think it would do very much good. Honestly, if they could have a feast and spend all of their wealth on luxuries just to enjoy them for a few years, that would be the best life they could expect to have. Right now, with some degree of life extension, certainly substantial since the Industrial Revolution, one sees a lot more of an orientation in human beings toward philanthropy, toward establishing a world where one doesn't just enjoy oneself, one provides for the future for oneself and for other people. There's a lot more charitable giving among the wealthy today than there was among the aristocrats of old. Why is that? Because it's believed that this is an investment in one's own future as well. I think there would be a great extension of that trend the longer human beings live. Because ultimately, if I'm going to be around for the next 500 or 1,000 years, there would be a much greater interest from my point of view that other people also be well educated, that other people also be comfortable so that they're in a position to go beyond mere subsistence and innovate and develop some of those solutions that will ultimately be necessary to save humankind from the great existential threats. As a result, people who live much longer are also going to look outward much more. And in how they spend their money, they're going to spend it less on conspicuous consumption, and they're going to spend it more on investing in the future for themselves and for other people as well. So that, in essence, is my understanding of the economic effects of future indefinite human life extension. I think not only will those effects be immensely positive, but it is necessary for us to bring about those effects in order for the entirety of human civilization to have a chance against the kinds of perils that, on a much larger time scale, occur routinely throughout the universe, and that, if human civilization stagnates at its present level, would leave us as sitting ducks. Seriously, it is time to progress to a point where human beings can confront these challenges. But to do that, we all need to live long enough for these challenges to be part of our time horizons. That's just one reason why living longer is so important. Thank you very much.